Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine's Zoominar producer, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program, North Africa's Forgotten Holocaust, with Sarah Abrevaya Stein and Aomar Boum. Joining them today is Moment's deputy editor, Sarah Brieger. Today's Zoominar is held in commemoration of tomorrow's International Holocaust Remembrance Day and is co-sponsored by the American Sephardi Federation. We are recording the Zoominar and it will be available later this week. Please type your questions in the Q&A box and we will try to get to as many questions as possible at the end of the session. Following the program, please visit Moment's website where you will find many articles related to the Holocaust and you can sign up to receive Moment's Anti-Semitism Monitor. Be sure to register for next week's Zoominar, Things Calvin Trillin Forgot to Say, with journalist and humorist Calvin Trillin. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to first introduce Jason Guberman, Executive Director of the American Sephardi Federation, to say a few words. Jason?
Thank you, Susan. The American Sephardi Federation preserves, perpetuates, and promotes the history, traditions, and rich mosaic culture of greater Sephardic communities as an integral, indeed essential part of the Jewish experience. We are honored today to join our friends at Moment Magazine in hosting Professors Sarah Abrevaya Stein and Aomar Boum, a recipient of the ASF and Association Memuna's Professor Chaim Zefrani Award. From Vichy labor and discipline camps in the deserts of occupied Morocco and Algeria, to the deportation of Libyan Jews from Benghazi to Bergen-Belsen, the Holocaust's impact on North African Sephardic communities remains, unfortunately, a hidden history. I remember meeting with a rabbi who considered himself an expert on the Holocaust when mentioning the Vichy camps that a Diarna Geomuseum researcher had recently documented. He incredulously pulled down from the shelf a large tome, an encyclopedia on the Holocaust, and was mystified. Not that he didn't find anything, he did. He found a singular sentence that mentioned the camps, but that only that sentence existed, and that his knowledge of this reality was non-existent prior to our meeting. We are grateful to Sarah and Aomar for their service to scholarship and the community, and we look forward to hearing their thoughts today on this Erev International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Sarah Brieger is Deputy Editor of Moment Magazine and Director of the Daniel Pearl Investigative Initiative. Sarah has won numerous awards, including first place for Religion Reporting of the Year from the Religion News Association, and first place for Best In-Depth News Writing on Religion for the American Academy of Religion. Sarah Abrevaya Stein is Professor of History, Vertebi Family Chair in Mediterranean Jewish Studies at UCLA, and Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Director of UCLA's Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies. A former Guggenheim Fellow and recipient of the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature, she is the author or editor of 9 books, many of them award-winning. Sarah's most recent book, Family Papers, A Sephardic Journey Through the 20th Century, was named a Best Book of 2019 by The Economist and Mosaic Magazine, a New York Times Editor's Choice book, and was a National Jewish Book Award finalist. Aomar Boum is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Los Angeles. He is interested in the place of religious minorities such as Jews, Baha'is, Shias, and Christians in post-independence Middle Eastern and North African nation states. He is the author of Memories of Absence, How Muslims Remember Jews in Morocco. Sarah and Aomar are co-editors of the Holocaust and North Africa. Please welcome Sarah Brieger, Sarah Abrevaya Stein, and Aomar Boum.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Jason, for partnering with us on this. This is a topic that I've long wanted to explore, and that we're able to do so in honor of International Holocaust Memorial Day is particularly meaningful. The Holocaust is usually thought of as a strictly European tragedy, and scholarship and popular imagination focuses mainly on the fate of Ashkenazi Jews. However, as we will talk about today, North African Jewry are part of this story as well, finding themselves at different points under Vichy rule, German occupation, and Italian fascism. For context, when we say North African Jewry, we're usually talking about the Jews of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. And it's important to remember that all of these countries had distinct wartime experiences, and they also had distinct relationships with colonialism and colonial powers. Aomar and Sarah's book, Holocaust in North Africa, note that it's not the Holocaust in North Africa, which I know was an intentional choice, explores all this and more. And as I'm sure we'll talk about today, the growing awareness of this chapter of Jewish history may change the way we view the Shoah, what it means to be a survivor, and how North African Jewish experiences during this period play into Jewish and Muslim narratives. Before we talk about World War II itself, I was hoping you guys could talk a little bit about what was the North African Jewish community like before World War II?
Happy to start that way. Sure, Sarah, thanks so much for the introduction, and Suzanne and Jason. I know I speak for Aomar and for myself when we express our gratitude for being able to be here in conversation with you and to honor International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So the population of pre-war North Africa is majority Muslim, with a Muslim population of approximately 7 million in Algeria, 8 million in Morocco, 2 million in Tunisia, 1 million in Libya, and a Jewish population of about 500,000 spread across this region. And I think the most important place to begin is that this is an internally diverse Jewish population, divided by location, with some Jews living in Mediterranean coastal cities, some Jews living in smaller mountain, desert, and coastal towns. It's divided by class, divided by religious practice, divided by sort of sub-Jewish diaspora in terms of where Jews came from. Linguistically, it's a diverse community. And additionally, what is really important for understanding the subsequent Holocaust history is that in the pre-war period, the Jews and the Muslims who live in these places are under different regimes, and therefore before the war, they're under different colonial regimes, and they have different legal statuses. And one of the reasons that I think both Aomar and I find the study of the Holocaust in North Africa so fascinating is that it is one of the only places in all of Holocaust history where Jews' experience of Nazi occupation or of fascism or of occupation by the Vichy regime is overlaid with a history of colonialism. The other place is the island of Rhodes. And this produces such an unusual wartime dynamic because it builds on this longer historical relationship between Jews and the states of empire, Jews and their Muslim neighbors, and diverse communities of Jews with one another. Now, Aomar, I'm sure you can build on that broad opening.
Yeah, I'm going to add one more point that's related to the history of these Jewish communities that go back before the Islamic presence in the region. So there are stories that talk about settlements of indigenous Jewish communities going back to the destruction of the first temple. Other stories talking about settlements that go back to the destruction of the second temple. But then what really complicates this richness in terms of indigenous as well as waves of other migration is the Jewish communities coming from after the Inquisition. And that added another layer, another very complicated and rich layer to these communities in Algeria, mostly in Algeria, Morocco, and to a certain extent in Tunisia.
And Aomar, I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about what the relationship between Jews and Muslims was like, both historically, and then if it changed at all, at the beginning of the 20th century with colonialization, with a nascent Zionist movement, things like that.
This is a relationship that has seen some moments of conflict, and sometimes even, especially during, for instance, if you take the example of the 11th century, there was a dynasty that called Al-Muwahhid dynasty, where Jews were forced to convert or expelled from many parts of North Africa. So then you move to some moments in the 17th as well as the 18th century. But overall, it's a relationship that was governed by forms of coexistence, social and economic coexistence. Jews were needed for the economy in terms of not only in terms of trade, but also in terms of connection between tribes also. Remember, we were talking about in the pre-colonial period, we're talking about many of these regions were not under the control of what we call central government. So that protection was governed and was given by tribal lords. And in certain cities where and urban, quote unquote, urban regions where Jews were under the sultans or under governors, that protection was maintained by these sultans. So it depends on regions. It depends on whether you're talking about tribal or rural regions or not. The other complicated part of the other reason also, you have also in remote areas like the Sahara, for instance, where I did a lot of my work, that also it's a region that was not affected by many of these restrictions, whether tribal or governmental.
And Sarah, I know you have a few images to share with us of pre-war Jewish North Africa.
I do. I'm happy to do that, and I'll perhaps follow a few images of the pre-war period with a map that will just get us oriented for our transition into the wartime era. So this is for viewers who want to follow up on this conversation with a deeper dive. This is the book that was mentioned in the introduction that Omar and I edited on this topic. So first, we just wanted to present a range of photographs, many drawn from the Photographic Archive of the United States Historical Memorial Museum, but in the book, they all have attribution to their appropriate source, showing the range of Jewish experiences in the pre-war period. And for viewers who may or may not be familiar with these scenes, you will immediately begin to see a diversity by class, by urban or rural landscape, by gender, by religious markings. We are, as Omar was saying as well, viewing a history of Jews in the pre-war period that is much just like European Jewry, is a history marked by diversity. That's really the central point. Like Jews everywhere, Jews in North Africa are also diverse. One of the things we didn't mention, which I think is relevant before we segue into the wartime period, is that in pre-war North Africa, we also have a population of European Christian settlers of diverse origin, Maltese, Italian, French, Sicilian, and more, who had begun to come to the region as early as the early 19th century and stayed there, many of them for generations. And it was this population that tended to be the most receptive to the anti-Semitic rhetoric being generated in Europe. And that will be relevant to our story. It isn't that no Muslims were drawn in by this rhetoric, but the important point is that tension in the region against and hostility, including physical violence against Jews in the pre-war era, tended to emanate from this population. So I've put up here a map for people to just focus on for a moment, and then I'll remove the images until we wish to return to them. Because I want to point out here that when we are talking about the wartime era, we're really talking about the presence of multiple regimes. We have site of direct Nazi occupation in Tunisia from November of 42 to May of 1943, but we also have Vichy, the rule of Vichy collaborationist government over Morocco and Algeria, and we have Italian fascist rule over Libya. So I think maybe I'll stop the share for a moment, but we can return to some of those images in time if we wish.
Okay, great. Someone just wrote in that they couldn't see the images, but if anyone else can, just let us know and we can try to fix that for you guys. As we kind of enter the wartime period, I'm curious, what were the restrictions placed against Jews once, in 1940, I think, like Vichy rule started and things like that?
Omar?
So the restrictions were initiated in two phases. The first anti-Jewish laws were introduced in October 1940, and the second anti-Jewish laws were introduced in early 1941. And these restrictions basically touched all sides of it. You have certain restrictions over how many Jews attend schools, over whether Jews can practice, be lawyers, or can be restrictions on their commerce, restrictions also that touched also, remember when during the from 1870, once Jews in Algeria got their citizenship through the Crimea Decree, you start seeing Jews becoming a major part of the different what we call départements in Algeria, the 3 departments, who had representatives in mainland France, about 6 representatives. So these Jewish communities really thrived. And once these laws were introduced and Jews lost their citizenship in Algeria, then they were affected economically and socially and politically. In Morocco, you have also these restrictions were included, but not to the extent that they affected the Jewish communities in Algeria. But still, a lot of Jews lost their businesses. A lot of Jews could not attend schools. A lot of Jews were forced to go from the areas where they purchased houses outside of the traditional neighborhood called the Mellah back to the Mellah. And especially you have cases in Fez, you have some cases in the city of Meknes, some cases in the city of Casablanca. But so we're going back again to the point that Sarah mentioned at the beginning. You have different experiences. It depends on how, sometimes it depends also on the will of colonial administrators. But so that's mostly in the urban areas. In the rural areas, from actually based on some of the research I've done in the South, some of the rural areas were not as affected as in the urban areas. And I think Sarah can also speak about the work she did in southern Algeria about the Saharan Jews in Algeria.
Well, and perhaps before we get into that specific case study, I can back up and add a few more comments to help frame Omar's. What I want to make clear is that the laws that were adopted in France that applied to French Jewry were also, by the Vichy regime, were also all imposed upon France's colonies in North Africa. So the identical laws squeezing Jews out of the professions, spoliation of property and businesses and belongings, limiting Jews' activity as educators or employers, the racial definition of who would be defined as a Jew, quotas limiting Jews' activity in certain professional realms, all of these things that we see implemented in France, we also see implemented in Algeria, which used to be a department of France. During the war, its status is still absorbed. Legally is the same, but also across the Vichy-occupied former colonies of France. And yet, there are differences in implementation, differences that have to do with the way in which these wartime laws and policies intersect with both, as Omar was saying, local conditions on the ground, including local leadership, and also pre-war statuses. Omar began his history of the legal unfurling of anti-Semitic and racist legislation in North Africa with the Vichy chronology, but it begins even earlier in the region under Italian control. It's as early as 1938 that the Italian fascist leadership imposes both upon the Jews of Italy and upon the Jews of Libya racial legislation. And we see over the course of war this initial legislation that has to do with identifying Jews, physically confining Jews, and also Aryanizing so-called the economies under Vichy or German or Italian control. This is all a prelude, which I know you want to talk about, Sarah, to the implementation, the creation of labor and internment camps, not only in Europe, but also in North Africa.
Yeah, I want to get to that. That's actually my next question, but we do have one interesting question. Someone asked, what's the relationship between Jews and the colonial powers before World War II, especially in urban areas?
It depends on their social and economic status too. So I think definitely when you look at, I can speak of Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, a lot of Jews were part of the bureaucracy, the colonial and even also the indigenous bureaucracies. They had, if you look at the case, for instance, of Morocco, Jews were part of the colonial, of the what we call the Makhzen system, which is the indigenous administration before France imposed its protectorate in 1912. But other Jews, other Jewish communities had nothing, were not part of this bureaucracy. So there is in the urban areas, you do have different members of the Jewish community who happens to be economically well off and economically successful. So they were part not only of these economic structures, but also they were part of the political structures when you think of Algeria and to some extent of Tunisia. And
to turn to camps, I think that's actually something that people are the most surprised about when talking about this period in North Africa, that there were internment camps or labor camps. Could you describe a little bit what these camps were, who they were for, and then also if any Jews traveled to concentration camps in Europe, Bergen-Belsen, for example, how did that happen?
Sure, I'm happy to begin with that. And I think what I will do is, if you're willing, Sarah, is return us just for a moment to some of the images that we provided. I will try to, begin where we left off. I had actually included a couple of images of European refugees, Jewish refugees, which is another story we may want to discuss. So this is one of a series of maps showing camps spread across the region. We have maps in the book that extend eastward to, and a bit later here to show you Tunisia and Libya. So indeed, I think I'll stop the screen share here. What we are seeing in North Africa during the war period is that the regimes in power are creating a web of camps across North Africa and stretching into, into the Saharan region. And these camps will in turn a wide diversity of prisoners, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish. They extend from camps that are situated around urban centers where prisoners would be forced to labor on infrastructure projects, to camps in the Sahara where prisoners were forced to labor on the building of a kind of fantastical trans-Saharan railway project, which was actually an inheritance of the French colonial regime under extremely difficult conditions. And I realized I removed the screen share before I could show you some of the photographs of the camps, which we can see if you or the viewers wish. But these camps, all told, were sites of incredible hardship, of poor conditions of hygiene and health, deprivation through lack of nourishment and shelter and clothing, site of forced labor, of physical torture. And they have a very complicated sort of human landscape with a diverse array of prisoners and also a diverse array of those who are serving the various regimes to oversee the daily running of the camps. And they're very complicated places, sometimes with porous boundaries that allow for a degree of movement in and out, not only from the prisoners to the outside town or region, but also from those outside looking in. Omar, I'm sure you can build effectively on that.
So as Sarah mentioned, I think you can categorize these camps into 3 categories. You have penal camps, you have confinement camps, and labor camps. The majority of the camps were labor camps. And as Sarah mentioned, they were part of this idea that goes back to the 19th century, which is a French colonial idea, to build a railroad system that connects the Mediterranean to sub-Saharan Africa and then link it to Senegal. And so, and that idea really began, so by 1940, with the Vichy government, Pétain decided to revive the project. And one way to do this, so he asked the governor of Algeria at the time to basically start it, and they thought about the best way for them is to seek or to use cheap labor is to use all these refugees who were Spanish Republicans fleeing the Franco War, who were also European refugees, Jewish and non-Jewish fleeing the Nazis and the fascist government. And some of them were moved from camps in France that they were already established as far back as 1938, even before the war, and to these camps in the Sahara. Some of them were picked up when they landed in Casablanca or other cities, and they were sent to these camps. It's interesting that most of these camps did not have a lot of women and children. There are some that did, but most of these were in areas in urban areas. But the majority, if not all, of the labor camps that are in the Sahara had only interned men. And I won't go into detail about some of the identity of these people, but some of them are really very, very well-named, well-known figures that became actually key figures in Jewish history in Europe and Latin America.
Actually, with that, I'm curious if there are any memoirs or histories that you guys recommend our readers look at to sort of study this period.
Yes, there is unlike memoirs that were written about the Holocaust in Europe, you have very few memoirs that actually were about with the work that the Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC and Yad Vashem and other institutions are doing. I think we're uncovering more and more some of these memoirs. But I can name one by Max Aub. Max Aub probably is he writes mostly in Spanish. There is also one memoir that was written by an Algerian Muslim who was in these camps, and he talks also about some of these dynamics between the different internees. It's mostly about the camp of Jenin Bourrezg. It's in the Sahara, and the name of the author is Arizki. You can find it online. I can send you some of these references that are actually on a PDF format. They're available, and you can share them with the people who are looking for these references.
That would be great. I think the people listening would really enjoy that.
And Sarah, if we can kind of offer a teaser, Omar and I are now involved in a project to follow up on the book that we published, The Holocaust in North Africa. We are working with Stanford University Press and the Holocaust Memorial Museum to publish the first English language source book that will gather together a very diverse array of voices from wartime North Africa, inclusive of local Jews, of Jewish refugees, of local Muslims, of Christians who found themselves in North Africa, either interned or in other circumstances through the war, to really complement the existing enormously rich corpus of sources that students and scholars and interested individuals can access about the European Jewish experience of the Holocaust or the Second World War. We really to date haven't had anything like this in English. And so you were asking about recommendations for sources, but I would add that our interest in this topic and our interest in proliferating in English accessible sources on this topic is partly to fill a gap that while really wonderful materials exist in French and in Arabic and in Spanish and in other languages, until recently, it's been very difficult for English language readers to explore this topic through the voices of those who experienced and lived and witnessed these events. And we're very grateful that our labors are joined by the labors of others who are engaged in a like project, as Omar mentioned, including the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem the Shoah Foundation and others who are working to gather testimony and to really flesh out our understanding of this history, which had been largely neglected and left aside from the public eye until recently.
Well, that's wonderful. I think I'm looking forward to it. I'm sure we're probably all looking forward to it. There are a few questions about camps, and I think in some ways they're more clarification questions. The one question is, were there any death camps in North Africa? And I think
no.
You guys can say, yeah, no. And then did Nazis also round up Muslims for labor camps? And how did this work in terms of the idea of being Aryan being best if they were just rounding up Jews? Omar, I don't know if that's something you want to touch on.
I think I haven't encountered, Sarah and I, we haven't encountered any Muslims who were picked up from North Africa and taken to the camps in Europe. But there were a lot of Muslims. I think a lot of people are familiar with Albania and the Soviet Muslims, but there were also North African Muslims from Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, and some Muslims from Lebanon and Egypt that died in some of the Nazi camps in mainland Europe, in Germany and in Poland. Of course, I'm not speaking here about Jews because we have a lot of cases of Jews who were taken from North Africa as well as in Europe to some of these camps. But we have cases, and the numbers are around, I would say, between 400 and 800 Muslims who died in some of these camps. There is some research that is done in Germany, and in German, there is no research that has been done about this topic in English.
And I would clarify, Sarah, that there are certainly no death camps in North Africa. That is simple and clear. There are some Jews, through complicated reasons, who are taken from North Africa to Europe. And there are Jews who are North African born or North African descended, who are mostly in France, who will be deported from France and taken to temporary camps, to internment camps, and then to death camps where many will perish. Additionally, there is a population of Jews in Italy who hold British or other European passports, who at a certain point will be taken by the fascist Italian powers to Italian internment camps in Italy. And when that territory is conquered by Germany, will then be deported to Bergen-Belsen. So this history is quite complicated, and while we do not see death camps created or ever envisioned in North Africa, we do see North African Muslims and Jews swept up in the killing machines that the Nazis erect in death camps, mostly in Eastern Europe. We certainly do see that history.
And I'm curious about, you had mentioned this before, European Jewish refugees who came to North Africa. I think you might have a few photos of them, and some are kind of high profile. I think I think of Casablanca when I think of that.
Sure. Omar, if you want to, I will share my screen, Omar, and if you at the same time want to introduce the topic, I will bring us to just two photographs in that arena.
Oh, you want me to say something about this?
Sure.
Okay. So this is Esti and Sophie Freud, the granddaughter of Freud. And as they were fleeing Europe, they ended up in France for some time, where they did learn some French. And then on the way, they had to flee to Casablanca, and they were stuck in Casablanca for about, I think, 6 months, where they had to wait for their paper to go from Casablanca to Tangier, and from Tangier to Lisbon, and then from Lisbon they came to the US. So this is one of the famous stories of the Freud stories. There is also another really important story for me, that this is a story because it has a Muslim connection. With, it's a story of Bernard Lecache, who was the head of the LICA, which is the International League Against Anti-Semitism and Racism. And the story of Bernard Lecache is important because it brings in Einstein, because he had a very important relationship with Einstein. He was one of the key figures, actually, that really pushed against the Nazis and were very critical of the Nazis in the 1930s, even though some Jews in France were against that because he was against that public criticism of the Nazis in the early part of the 1930s. And then you have also his relationship with the Muslims in Algeria in particular, and then Tunisia and Morocco, because he was trying to fight the rise of anti-Semitism especially after the Constantine pogrom in 1934. And he came he came with his wife to Tunisia. He went on a tour for over a month on Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria, and he built this relationship with Muslim leaders. Unfortunately, that project would not develop in the after the war.
And I'm curious, during that time, what was the Muslim reaction to these new racial laws, these labor camps, both from the leadership perspective and then also from the neighbor to neighbor perspective? Sarah, is that something that?
Yeah, sure. Again, these histories are always complex, and the answer to this, there's no single answer here. There are, as Aomar was just describing in relationship to the organization LICA, formed in France by the son of East European Jewish immigrants to France, Bernard Lecache, there are Muslim religious and secular leaders who will join together with Jews like Lecache and local Jews to protest racist laws, to call for example, the restitution of the medical title of their Jewish colleagues pushed out of the medical profession, to object to racial laws writ large. There are also, on the other hand, some instances of Muslims who are seduced by the anti-Semitic propaganda that had been long proliferated through the region by the colonial powers and also by European colonial Christian settlers in the region. And during the beginning in the 30s and through the war, there is also a Nazi presence, an official presence and an unofficial presence in Spanish Morocco, in northern Morocco. And there is a sort of propagandistic office operating with the ambition of dispersing anti-Semitic propaganda in Arabic to attempt to recruit Muslim allies to the cause. And there is evidence that some responded to this call and sort of accepted the anti-Semitic claims being proliferated. But the history is diverse. Aomar, I don't know if you want to add more to that story.
I think the northern part of Morocco is important here because of this relationship between some of the nationalist leaders in the north and Radio Berlin, which was part of the German propaganda in not only in northern Morocco, but also it tried to expand its activities also in urban areas like Fez and Rabat. You have also in Morocco, there are, and this is where you start seeing a difference between the grabbing of some of the Jewish property. Once the anti-Jewish laws started to be implemented, some people did take advantage of that. And so a lot of Jews did lose, Muslims as well as sometimes Christians. They took advantage of these laws, and they tried to force Jews either to sell their property. We have a lot of cases in the archive, and some of the Jews, actually some of the members of the Jewish community ended up taking back and getting back their property right after the war, 43, 44, even sometimes even during the war. So there is, it's, as Sarah mentioned, it's a broad region with a lot of complexities, local and regional and national complexities, and where sometimes you have some of these cases are really, the numbers of these cases are high, in other areas they're not.
There are a few questions about the Sultan of Morocco and how much he enacted the Vichy laws.
That's a great question. I think this is a question that I'm personally working on a project on this question with one of my mentors and former advisors, Daniel Schroeder, and they, you have to remember that. Let me put the context here. Let me in terms of the anti-Jewish laws, they definitely have the seal, what we call the seal of the Makhzar, which is the signature of the Sultan. And that signature basically is done in the context of any law, because Morocco was a protectorate, was a French protectorate. So any law that has to be implemented has to have that seal. But of course, the laws are, the Sultan didn't have that much power. So that's, I think a lot of people, when they look at that signature, they would argue that, well, the king didn't do anything to protect Jews. But when you ask, anthropologically speaking, I've done a lot of interviews with Moroccan Jews, and when you look at over 90% of them, they argue, the overall thinking is that the Sultan protected Jews based on his actions also that were also personal to leadership of the Jewish community. So you have the idea of quote unquote inviting them to the what we call the throne day. You have also the connection between Jews who were part of the palace, whether during the pre-colonial and even during the colonial and post-colonial period. So that intimacy and that social and political relationship between the monarchy and leadership of the Jewish community was very strong, and that actually part of the reason why the Moroccan Jews hold the monarchy and hold the king at a high level, sometimes at a saintly, quote unquote, saintly level sometimes. Now, what the king did as far as to push against some of these anti-Jewish laws, because because the anti-Jewish laws are racial laws, they go outside from a legal Islamic perspective, at least from the thinking of the king or the Sultan, they go outside of this idea that the protection, as part of the protection of his role as protector of Jews, quote unquote, as dhimmis, as Ahl Dhimma, as from an Islamic perspective. So it's still a case that debated. There is a huge controversy. There is a huge debate about it. I think even institutions, Holocaust institutions, have a different perspective about it. But what I think needs to be done, and that's part of the research that has to be done in the future, is to really focus on oral histories from the perspective of Moroccan Jews themselves, or members of the communities who were part of this story. And that's where I think the research is very limited, because we do not have enough archival material and documentation, whether coming from the French colonial perspective, that really gives an idea about what the Sultan thought about it, what the Sultan thought about these anti-Jewish laws.
And when the war was over, what happened to, were these Jewish laws repealed? Was Jewish property returned? There are a few questions about reparations, which is obviously much later. Do you guys have any information about that?
Again, it depends, because here there are some of these laws were repealed after the Operation Torch. Okay, so but the level and the immediacy of basically putting them on the ground and applying them on the ground differed. I can say, for instance, an example about the refugees who were held in some of these camps, in labor camps. Some of them really stayed in these camps for over a year, some until 1943, 44. And we have cases until 1945. And it took a lot of pressure from the American Jewish communities in New York and other places in the US to basically force the American leadership and the president and the army to send their own people and to free these refugees. So that's,
and if I can, I was just going to clarify the timeline for a moment to say that Operation Torch refers to the Anglo-American invasion of French Moroccan and Algeria that concludes on November 16th, 1942. And there is a sort of verbal commitment by the Allied authorities that laws will be overturned, that camps will be disbanded. But in fact, the Allied forces are in many cases working with the same French bureaucracy which implemented these laws and interned these individuals and oversaw the camps. And they do not release all of those imprisoned in camps or in other kinds of labor facilities immediately. And that is why, as Aomar says, it can take up to a year, I think in some cases even longer, for these people to be released. And the legal process of restitution is much longer and arguably in some sense never fulfilled. But there is evidence of, for example, forced laborers working on the Trans-Saharan Railway even after Operation Torch is over. So officially, the war here is over, and yet the camp system is still in place. So I know there was also a question about restitution, which is a much longer story, but that immediate post-war, non-post-war story is so important for understanding the insult that Jews, Muslims, and Christians interned in this region, whether they're from the region or from beyond, felt about this chimerical victory by the Allies with Operation Torch.
Sarah, could we look at a few photos of the camps? I know you have some.
Yes.
I think that'd be really interesting.
Sure. Okay, so this is, again, we're beginning with a map of some of the camps in French-occupied North Africa and French West Africa. Here we see the camp of Jelfa, which Aomar has done a great deal of research on and can be read about in our book, in Algeria. One of the Trans-Saharan Railroad sites in Morocco.
And you can see the military clothes of the Spanish. Those are Spanish, some of them are Spanish Republicans. Yeah.
I'm showing here a map of, a more detailed map of Tunisia, although indeed not all of the sites here are represented either in Tunisia and in Libya. And here we switch a little bit to look at some of the forced labor on infrastructural projects around Tunis. There were a great number of labor camps in the vicinity of Tunis. And here we see images of Jewish forced laborers working in that vicinity. I think there's perhaps one more. And this is a slightly different picture showing, I mentioned earlier, some of the Libyan Jews who held the papers of allied countries, the legal papers of allied countries, who were deported first to Italian camps and thence to German camps, including Bergen-Belsen. And here we see survivors of that entourage returning to Tripoli. And I believe there's one more picture of a very famous figure, Victor Perez, who is a heavyweight boxing champion who is deported. Aomar, remind me, I don't want to mix up his precise history.
He was picked up from France, from Paris.
From France, and I think sent first to Drancy and then to Auschwitz, where he would perish.
Yes.
So that gives us an example of a kind of range of internment experiences, and there are many more.
And for people interested in knowing more about him, there is actually a documentary about him.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
There are some questions about if there was a resistance movement, both anti-fascist Muslims or Jewish resistance.
Sarah, you want to say?
Well, Omar spoke earlier about Lika, which is an organization that brought together Jews and Muslims in opposition to the rise of the racist policies of Nazism and beyond, which is one example of the kind of resistance we see surfacing. We do see some joining with the so-called Free French Army, and by some, I should say it's both Jewish and Christian European refugees, so local Jews, European Jews, and Christian refugees who will join with the Free French Army fighting with the Vichy, the French. So the Free French Army fighting with the Vichy French Army in the course of the war. There are also, smaller scale acts of resistance along the lines that we see across Europe in this period. Muslim families protecting the property of Jewish families, people taking children in, people arranging to help others with papers when they most need them. There is an incredibly important philanthropic activism. And I would mention especially two such organizations. One would be the work of the Quakers, and the other would be the work of
Ellen Ben Attar.
Ellen, yes, exactly. But I'm thinking she works for, at some point, for both the and the Joint Distribution Council, and they are extremely important, these organizations and some others, in fielding the desperate pleas for help from a huge range of people who find themselves in dire straits in North Africa, whether they are European Jewish refugees or Jewish and non-Jewish former volunteers to fight on in the Spanish Civil War for the International Brigade, who then find themselves in North Africa, or North African Jews who find themselves interned. These are other forms of resistance that are so important in offering people the financial and logistical and emotional support that they require.
So we are unfortunately running out of time. One question I really want to get to is more of a broader question. If you have any thoughts of why the North African narrative has been relegated to the margins of Holocaust history and memory.
Wow, that's a great question.
Do you have
I think it's on both sides. I think you have a marginalization that's taken place from the perspective of the Ashkenazi Jews, and where the other story of the Sephardic and non-Jews coming from Arab lands. So, and then you have also, I think there is also a marginalization that's taking place from within School of History in North Africa itself. So I think we don't see until recently the interest of North African historians, whether in Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, or Libya, that was not a priority too. So, but you do see, but there is now more and more interest. I think that there is an increasing number of people in Tunisia interested in this topic, an increasing number of people in Morocco, within Moroccan and Tunisian universities interested in this topic. And also there is also an interest within these institutions, like as I mentioned, Yad Vashem, I mentioned the Holocaust and War Museum themselves. So there is more availability of research, of archival research, of archives that now researchers in the US and outside of the US now can have easy access to the research and the work that should be done and that needs to be done?
I would add one thing to that, which is that I think if we reframe this question slightly, one of the things we can say is that the boundaries of Holocaust history have been steadily, slowly, jerkily expanding since a field of Holocaust studies was created to include, a geographically diverse landscape, to include the experiences of women, to include the experience of refugees who might find themselves within the Nazi dragnet in a country that is not their own, to include the experience of Southeastern European, Sephardic, Ladino-speaking Jews, to include the experience of families and children. So this, if we take a long view, the inclusion of the Holocaust's North African chapters are part of this long attempt to understand better, more deeply, the diversity of Holocaust histories, the diverse geography of Holocaust histories, the complex timeline of this story, and the varied actors who played a role, across the entire spectrum of actors who played a role. To diversify that category, in all of these ways, the work we and our colleagues are doing in this realm is really part of a broader attempt to understand more and better and in a more fine-grained fashion what the Holocaust looked like and how it was experienced.
And do you see, I think it's clear that you can see there's been kind of this expansion of scholarship. I'm curious if that has trickled down to the general, the popular imagination of what the Holocaust is. And if not, if there's something that we should be doing to make sure that people understand how varied and diverse the Holocaust experience could be.
So can I ask, so you mean in the US or outside of the US?
I think I'm talking mainly about the US.
I don't know. I don't know. I have to see what I think in terms of university circles, Sarah and I, we can definitely say that this is gaining more and more relevance, and people are more interested in this topic and learning more about it. I don't know about the general public. I think events like these will inform the general public, and that's the idea here.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see by the fact that our question and answer has, over 118 questions, which, does not often happen, shows how hungry people are for more information about this.
I think there are signs of expanding interest and expanding knowledge. We've been very pleased to partner with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum to help add to their encyclopedia, to embellish upon a small foundation of encyclopedic articles about this topic, which are there for students and classes and the general public to learn this history. We are seeing the collection of testimony. Of course, we wish it had happened decades ago, but we are seeing that by many of the organizations, many of we've already mentioned, that are determined to record Holocaust testimony. One does see a kind of uptick in cinematic coverage and even fictional coverage of this topic. It's probably more in depth in other languages, in French, certainly, than in English. But I think for that surging interest, it is still true that if you were to survey, for example, the syllabi of Holocaust history classes taught at universities across this country, or to survey the history of North African history classes, the syllabi of those classes, you would find still that this represents a pretty broad black hole, despite all of these efforts. So we are hoping to participate in the remedying of that forgetting.
We're unfortunately out of time, but there's been 2 questions about, Aomar, about the painting behind you. I'm wondering if that could be a nice way to end. I don't know.
This is a painting from one of my friends. I think it's a reflection of some of the aspects of African history. So I don't know. I don't know the name, I don't know the artist, but it was a present that was given to me by one of my close friends.
Okay, that's great. And I just wanted to say that, maybe I'm actually really surprised by the interest as I'm seeing the questions. Maybe we'll do some sort of follow-up either, in the magazine itself or, another Zoom or something like that, because it's clear that people have a lot of questions and really want to know more about this. Okay. Oh, Suzanne, you're on mute.
Okay, so oops, here we go. Thank you so much, Sarah and Aomar, for this very informative and obviously very important program. And as Sarah said, we definitely want to do some kind of follow-up because the interest is clearly here. I also want to thank Jason Guberman from the American Sephardi Federation and for them co-hosting this program today. And we do have additional programs in the works with them, so please stay tuned. Again, thank you everyone for sending in your questions. We're sorry that we weren't able to get to all of them because there were so many. I encourage everyone to purchase Sarah and Aomar's book, The Holocaust in North Africa, where you can read more. We will be sending out a follow-up email, and we will include all of the references that both of them made to other books and movies and all of that stuff. So we will send that to you as soon as the program link is available. And please visit, I'm going to send right now in the chat. I will send the website addresses for both Moment Magazine and the American Sephardi Foundation, and you can see more at both of those. And please visit momentmag.com to subscribe to the magazine. We do have also a special for tomorrow for those who subscribe. And that is, and next week, please register for our next Zoominar with Calvin Trillin. So thank you all, and we will see you next time. Take care.
Thanks,
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.